All right, welcome everybody to the VALR Podcast. It's a great pleasure to be able to welcome Yat Siu to the podcast. Yat Siu is someone that is known across the crypto space, the Web3 space, blockchain space, whatever you want to call it. And he has a lot of views that I'm very excited to dig into. Yat and I have not chatted before. So Yat, this is really going to be just a conversation to get to know each other a little bit and also to hear about your views and your perspectives, which have made the rounds in many different podcasts. So I'm looking forward to actually going a little bit deeper with you, also to understand kind of what's driving you, why you're in this space, and also what your aspirations are. So I'm going to start off with that, which is just a little introduction to yourself, but also wrapping up with really, our days on this mortal plane are limited. So when you look back about what you want your legacy to be, what are you trying to really achieve in life?
Wow, going deep right away. Anyway, it's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me. Pleasure. And I guess very briefly, in terms of my background, I was actually born in Austria, in Vienna, in the child of the 70s. So been around the block, meaning that I not only witnessed,
Did you just say you're a child of 17?
70s.
70s. Okay, so, I thought that was a very big family you're from. Okay, 70s.
No.
Right.
Okay. I'm an only child. I'm an only child. Okay. But I grew up in Austria in the 70s, and meaning that I've sort of not only lived through the first eras of, I guess, where technology really started to shape the world on the consumer level, like with personal computers, going from, I guess, sort of pre-internet platforms like CompuServe, and Genie to eventually AOL, and then sort of the internet as we know it today, and also experiencing Web 1, Web 2, and what we have now in Web 3. But also growing up in a time where we still had the Cold War. Basically, we're growing up in Austria. My mom, being an opera singer first and an opera director, she used to work on the other side of the Iron Curtain, as in she was working in East Berlin at Commodore. And so he witnessed a totally different experience, which I got to see as well. Right. So all these things have kind of shaped my worldview and kind of taken a perspective, which, maybe as a child I didn't appreciate it fully, but obviously has shaped the kind of person that I am today and how I think about the world, having experienced not only sort of a very communist environment to a socially democratic one, then moving to the US, with Atari, which was my first job, and then eventually sort of starting a business there in the 90s, and then also working with Silicon Graphics, experiencing, capitalism, and then coming to Hong Kong, starting one of Hong Kong's first internet service providers, experiencing essentially Uber capitalism, basically capitalism on steroids, with no guardrails whatsoever at the time, right? So it's sort of given me sort of a view around that, and when you talk about sort of the legacy that I wish to sort of leave behind, I think with Animoca brands, I guess in some ways I feel like that is a way in which you can hopefully fulfill that legacy, or at least a big part of it, which is to give everyone a stake in the networks that they construct. Right? So, in other words, the problems we have in the world is around inequity. Right? And inequity, by the way, has always been the problem broadly in everything. Right? If you think historically, right, the root of all problems tends to come from a form of inequity or the other. And they end up, if it's very bad, become revolutions and all sorts of other things that emerge from that. And I think the current sort of landscape of inequity is around wealth inequality. Right? When you think about what happened with COVID, post-COVID, over $42 trillion of new value was created, new wealth was created. 2/3 of that went to the 1 percentile. And we know the outcome, right? Which is basically the rich get richer, the poor get poorer. But the result has been that rather than look at capitalism as a way to improve everyone's lot, which is kind of what happened in the past, people have become anti-capitalist, partially because they don't understand it, but also because they're not included. And I think the current form of capitalism has been corrupted because it's become centralized. And I think in the past, governments used to understand this, so they had, rules around antitrust, break up these monopolies that would essentially sort of create these, what ultimately would become an anti-capitalist framework. But for instance, when monopolies are created in any industry, actually what happens is it's a reduction of a free market. it actually kills free market. And so the irony is that even though capitalism in its sort of traditional form aims to have a monopolistic outcome, like a zero-sum outcome, once it achieves the zero-sum situation, it actually becomes staunchly anti-capitalist. It starts to want to control everything. Right? So the role of government was to break it up, to ensure that a free market would, broadly speaking, still exist. And since that's failed, particularly in the sort of data economies out there, it's been a problem, broadly speaking, for people where they were unable to sort of partake in this. And so, when you talk about that 1 percentile that's benefited from the growth of, I guess, capital appreciation, it's precisely that. It's a 1 percentile who are capitalists. And the rest of the world is still, broadly speaking, sitting in a labor economy. And I think it's a failure of our education where we have not taught people that, yes, labor has value, but actually capital is where the value accrues because ownership of things are needed to develop against. So the reason why we're so excited about Web3 is that we think Web3 is really the only way, or maybe the best way, maybe there's better ones in the future, and where we can have a future where everyone can be a capitalist. So I am a staunch capitalist, having experienced, sort of extreme forms of socialism and mild forms of socialism. I actually think it's not the solution. And I think, when you look at the lens of history, I think it's been proven that that's actually not the right answer. Although some people don't study history and some people don't have a perspective on that, or maybe think of it in revisionist ways. So they don't actually think about sort of the negative outcomes because they don't know what that is. But so I believe that the future is one where we need to make more people capitalists. So how do we make the 1% become 5%, 10%, 15%, 20%? And by the way, there was a small period in time over the last 30, 40 years, not excepted the last, let's say, 10 plus, right, where the middle class was growing. And the growth of that middle class actually was the growth of a new capital class, because it meant that you could, the American dream was to buy your home in the form of an asset, to build from that, and to have opportunity, right? That was kind of where that is. But, the youth today doesn't have a way of doing it because real estate is too expensive. And also the value of labor and the value of money, which is, I guess, one major aspect that was betrayed, you could say, over the last few decades, is that you would basically have money that would be devalued over time. And therefore, the value of the labor that you receive and the cash and the savings you have in money actually sort of is reduced in value, when in fact, the value would accrue on the assets that you should be owning, such as real estate or maybe equity or these type of things. But most of the world still doesn't participate in that, not because they may not be able to, but either they're not financially educated because they don't know how, or two, there's no good framework for them to participate in this. And this is why I think Web3 is so fascinating. Without sort of delving straight into the mechanics of it, through tokenization, for instance, you could become a capital owner, capitalist effectively, at a fraction of the cost of a network as large as, I don't know, billions of dollars. Like, say, if you take an L1, L2, let's say the Ethereum network. Sure, you own the token, which is a representation of its network effects. But it also means by owning the token, you become a capital owner, or effectively a capitalist of that token. It also means that you can have a framework where millions, hundreds of millions, even billions could actually own a token. Right? You can't do that as an equity holder. And the biggest companies in the world, like Facebook and Google and Apple, I think they have somewhere between 30 to 80,000 shareholders. And of course, they're held by mutual funds and they can expand on that. But the point is, you can't have 1 million active shareholders in a company. It doesn't work, right? The governance systems don't work. The paperwork required, the sort of systems in place to manage 1 million shareholders is simply impossible to do so. But you can have 1 million token holders. Right? So you can envision a future where 1 billion people could own capital, through tokenization. But you can't see this with equity. Like, if I want to buy a house, for instance, first of all, it's unattainable. Then how do I buy fractional ownership of a house? Well, that's hard as well. And then you have all these rules around, well, if you are someone who doesn't have a lot of money, then you're excluded from the opportunity from purchasing certain things because you're not considered sort of, of a certain wealth class. Right? So all these things have come into place, with good intentions, but ended up restricting access to this. Right? And so I think Web3 is the answer. So, I hope that, in speaking to the question of legacy, that there's we'll help construct, by growing Web3, a future where all of us actually become stakeholders, as in owners in the things that we build, right? And when you go to the classic sort of Lockean example of sort of we ought to own things from our labor, which is of course an old construct from hundreds of years ago, because labor was, I guess, the source of value. Today, the source of our value is our attention and our creativity. Right? If you look at the social media networks or whatever, they're actually owning that value that we're giving. So this is the other point, which is that value is established. So we're not saying that our attention, our creativity, and our time online isn't valuable. It is clearly valuable. It's a reason why 9 out of the top 10 companies in the world are basically technology/data companies. They are the owners of our network effects, and they have together amongst them, outside of $1 trillion market cap, say each have, $1 trillion of cash sitting in their balance. Cash, okay? That doesn't do anything, right? These guys also don't invest in the ecosystem, right? They're literally just hoarding. But this is again sort of a problem because the capital is not actually being efficient, it's not being productive for society, which is the whole system and government used to be that taxation was supposed to be a mechanism in which you take value back and then basically help make that productive for the rest of the community in question. So all these things have altered and changed. And I think governments are somewhat powerless to make these changes. But I think technology like Web3 can alter that because, of course, for you as an end user, having sort of ownership in, let's call it an L1, L2, or ownership in things like the sandbox or NFTs, actually makes you a capital owner. So I think the future is that we will be capitalists. That's where we need to go. I think labor will be anyway displaced by AI, robotics, humans, sort of machines. I mean, right? Human minds have to be more focused on the creative side, which is anyway I think what we're tuned to. And if I was to, we used to talk about this thing called universal basic equity, or maybe some people call it sort of universal basic ownership. The point being that we're all entitled to ownership, and that we should all have a stake in what we do, as opposed to universal basic income, which to me rings a lot more socialist. And I know some people, like Sam Altman, talk about that a lot, but I think that's the wrong answer, because handouts themselves have not known to work anywhere really over time. And it also creates a sense that everyone ought to have the same, which isn't true, because we're all different in a way. Whereas I think ownership is a way in which you accept that your contribution is valued based on your effort around this as well. But in this sense, if you own a stake in something, then actually, it's okay if some people have a bigger stake than I have, but I'm still in it together with you. And you notice this in the kind of tribalism that exists in Web3, where at the end of the day, I may object with you in some form or fashion, but we have one common purpose, which is the growth of Ethereum, or the growth of Solana, or the growth of Sandbox. It doesn't really matter. The point is that we're now come together in common purpose because we have ownership.
Sure.
And this isn't really possible in the Web2 framework, because at the end, I don't own any stake in Instagram, or I don't own any stake in TikTok, which also means, by the way, there's no loyalty in these networks, right? I mean, all the people who used to have big followers on Instagram, they happily switched over to TikTok when it provided a better framework. Or when you think about what happens with MySpace and Friendster and Facebook, but there's no loyalty attached to them because they don't have ownership. And so I think it's a more powerful model. It's a more inclusive model. It's a more equitable model. And, it's a long-winded answer to say that. I think, hopefully our legacy can be to create a world in which most of the world has ownership, as opposed to today where most of the world has no ownership.
Got you. Thank you. Thank you for that comprehensive answer. So from what you've said, like kind of one of the animating impulses of what you're doing is really to try to make the world a fairer place. Is that fair to say? Like try to solve some of the inequities that you talked about earlier?
Yes. So I think, making it more fair and more equitable is definitely a mission goal, but it really comes down to the root of ownership. Right? So in other words, we're not saying, and I just want to be sort of clear about this, that we're not saying that it needs to be the same, right? Correct. So sometimes people replace or think of the world as fair as a form of equality, right? Yeah. That's not what we're advocating, right? We're advocating just that we ought to have ownership in the things that we do, but you still have to work for it, right? You still have to, and I think capitalism doesn't work when everyone has the same, right? That's the other side of socialism. So we think, so just to clarify on that, right? I think it's important that we have a dynamic where sort of the root of our effort and sometimes good fortune actually gives us essentially an opportunity profile, which then provides for an opportunity for hope for others to build upon, right? So again, we're driven by hope, right? And we're driven by creating opportunities because of that hope and that opportunity. And I think this is the part where sometimes, I think on both sides, right, when you say, well, you could be in a despotic, tyrannical situation where you have no hope because someone's taken everything from you, which is kind of the centralized problem. But the other problem, of course, is that everyone gets the same. That's what I experienced when I was sort of visiting my mom and seeing, Easter. Is that when everyone does get the same, or most of the people get the same, except of course the top, then you actually don't have hope either, right? Right? No, because you're robbed of that opportunity.
Yeah, I mean, I have a similar view on one side, which is, I think communism and equality of absolutely everybody has to have exactly the same. That doesn't work. There's a lot of injustice in that as well, because different people put in different amounts of effort, and then it's not fair for people to be getting exactly the same. So I think there is an injustice almost in complete equality, right? On the other side of the spectrum,
rights.
Yeah. On the other side of the spectrum, I think is probably the world that we live in currently, where there is a tremendous amount of inequality, of extremes of the rich and of extremes of the poor. And I think that there needs to be some narrowing of those extremes. Otherwise, like, humanity doesn't have a very hopeful future, because I don't think that until there's justice, I don't think we can truly have peace around the world. But the reason I brought that up is that, when we look at, I share your aspirations, but when we look at, and I'm as passionate as you are about the crypto space, but when you look at kind of the Gini coefficient of crypto, of these tokens that we're talking about, we see that the distribution right now is actually probably worse than the most unequal countries around the world. So I wanted to kind of get your thoughts about how does that play out, where, the holdings right now are very concentrated. Do you think that just by nature of more people coming into the network, that will solve things, or what is the future that you see?
So let me just first, maybe to my perspective, I actually think it's not with how you describe it, in the sense that from a broad brushstrokes perspective, value is more distributed across when you compare it to the current Web2 frameworks, right? So meaning the richest people in crypto aren't necessarily by ratio larger in wealth than the richest people in, let's call it, the non-crypto world, right? When you talk about traditional wealth, right? And the second thing is, I think crypto, we think of it almost like as a nation, right? So it is like the emergence of a new country in which you have different levels of wealth being created, but they're also wealth created from, and this is the key point, of new sources and new people that haven't had wealth before, right? So meaning that, so for instance, in America, by percentage, the people who actually own, I guess, digital assets in this category and have attained the wealth in digital assets by concentration are larger in the minorities, for instance, right? So meaning that when you look at the minority segments, whether it's Latinos or Asian Americans or whichever, right, they have a much higher percentage of ownership and wealth generation from this, which you can see, for instance, in places like Florida, specifically Miami as an example, versus other places, which means that you're creating a new force that is actually challenging the existing incumbent structures around wealth. By the way, this has been true for sort of, even just in millennia, but when you think about just recently, the early tech boom, well, back then, early tech boom, when I was mature, had the same thing, right? Or, in the 80s and 90s, and 2000s, a whole new wealth class of people came out of Silicon Valley. Yes. And people were like, oh, these people who are they wearing jeans and t-shirts into these fancy clubs? And so, suddenly it was a whole new class of people. The people were like almost had a kind of cognitive dissonance in terms of what's going on here. Yeah. Like, he's not wearing a suit, and he's not part of this club in New York, and he doesn't buy a Mercedes Benz, or like whatever construction they had in their mind on what sort of, let's call it, wealthy people were. A new class came in and disrupted the space and created new opportunity profiles. So today it's Web3 and crypto, but it was technology before. And we see this in other trends, whether it's the Japanese in the 70s and 80s, whether it's the Chinese in the 90s and 2000s, right? Like, a whole new class of people that didn't have money suddenly had money, and then they came and impacted the world. But broadly speaking, they've brought new wealth into these places, right? Whether it's through tourism, through purchases, right? And so this industry of people that are in Web3 that are having created this new wealth, whether they were lucky to hold Bitcoin and suddenly, it's up worth a lot, or whether they participate in space, doesn't really matter. They're now spending in these new digital ecosystems in products and services that actually don't necessarily equate to the traditional wealth, right? So, for instance, like the status symbols of my time when I grew up was a Rolls Royce.
Yeah.
I mean, like, it's crazy, right? I mean, who talks about a Rolls Royce anymore, right? But as an example, Rolls Royce, Jaguar, maybe it was a Benz, right? And then it kind of moved to BMWs and Audis and whatever, right? And now it's Tesla. But so again, the generations of that new category of wealth generated comes with this new culture that brings in new people. And the difference, I would say, that in Web3 is because it's so decentralized, the opportunity for wealth exists for everyone, right? It's like this new country. It's like the journey into the West. If you came to America, you can go and stake your land, basically, in the west of America. That's kind of where we are right now. We just go in and say, I stake this land, I try, I may fail, but I have a better opportunity profile than where I exist today, which broadly speaking feels hopeless. To give you a stat, over the last 3 years, over $21.7 billion of value was dropped in the form of tokens as airdrops to communities broadly. I can't think of a single event, certainly in the last...
Say that again. What's that stat again? I missed that stat.
$21.7 billion
billion
worth of tokens.
Yeah.
Billion was dropped to just community members in Web3 through airdrops. Whether it's things like Bitcoin or whether it's things like Uniswap, doesn't really matter. The point is that through these different participatory mechanisms, where end users contributed, and some millions, and some thousands, and some 100,000. But the point is that there's a value distribution that went across large community members who benefited broadly, right? And again, this is capitalism. So the idea isn't that everyone makes the same, but everyone broadly benefited from it, right? Nobody can say, hey, I've been engaged in crypto in the last 3 years, and I basically didn't get anything out of it, right? Again, maybe he made more than I did, but we still broadly grew because the opportunity for the whole thing expanded, right? And that's kind of the space that we're in. And it's also the opportunity for people to come in at this level because it's inclusive with no borders. So that's the other thing. When you see about a market, say like China, the growth is great. You gotta go to China, right? So there are physical restrictions. Even in the US, if you wanted to expand in those markets, well, you have to move to Silicon Valley, right? That's kind of expensive. You want to go, live in Palo Alto? Good luck. That's pricey. Like, how do you get in there? Or, prior to that, what was the land of opportunity? It was Hollywood. People moved to Los Angeles and they tried to, it's all these things. So the barriers were always in some form or the other, right? And now essentially, these barriers are sort of declining. And in Web3, really just need a wallet and go online. And then you look at places like Southeast Asia, like the Philippines, with Web3 gaming. Millions of people who are literally making pennies and dollars are making, of course, they're not making thousands, but they're making many dollars more, meaning that their net income has increased more significantly. And so now comes to my final point about why I think it's much more inclusive. Every asset is a form of ownership. Okay, so I'm not saying, for instance, that and as a capital ownership, meaning that you could take something that wasn't very valuable in Web2, but now because you can make it into an intellectual property asset, right? Because with NFTs and blockchain, you can secure that and create sort of mechanisms around essentially capital formation. But you can then sell it on, even if it's only worth $5 or $10 a year. Now, think what would happen if the music industry, or the film industry, or even the art industry didn't have the ability to create capital formation out of their intellectual property. But we wouldn't have an industry of music that was nearly this size. We wouldn't have a movie industry or any creative industry of this size if we didn't have a way in which we could capture value formation. The problem, of course, is that you can only do it with assets that generate a certain amount of income because the legal cost and the infrastructure cost to support it is high. So if you only make $100 a year on some music you create, well, it's not worth creating an intellectual framework and copywriting it and trademarking it and using a lawyer. But with an NFT, you can do this for less than $1 because now I can secure it and I can say this is mine and I can prove it because I issued this. People are doing it with dance moves. People are doing it with educational content like with Open Campus. Like there are all sorts of ways in which people do this. So that means that a place where you might only make as an income $10 or $20 a month can now have capital formation, right? And the basis, by the way, of the wealth of our nations in the Western world comes from capital formation. the fact that I have property ownership that would then allow me to invest in this long-term future of a 10, 20, 30, 40-year horizon is why, a bank can give you a mortgage, right? So the economic system can thrive from that. So it's also activating the kind of countries that don't have access to this, create that, which is why Southeast Asia, Middle East, South America are some of the biggest growth markets in Web3, right? So, and I think the capital ownership thing is really important because now that we all have a stake in it, even if you're passive, what happens is that simply by holding on to it, I'm now a member of this network, which means that if it grows, again, this guy might make a lot more money, but here's the thing. We're in a shared network, which is a core belief at Animoca Brands. So if the network grows, how do I grow with the network itself, even if I have a lesser stake? And you can do this in Web3. In Web2, you can't do that. So it's great if Facebook is doing well. So what? I could be building in the internet world, and I don't get a benefit from that because only Facebook benefits, right? So the current Web2 construct and traditional capitalist framework is exclusionary by design, right? Now in an economy though, let's say America just grows by 10% a year. Generally speaking, everyone should benefit from this, right? I might not benefit like you, who might be selling more cars than me, who might be in the restaurant, but my restaurant will still improve because the economy improves as a whole, because more people have money and more people are spending, right? That's kind of what should happen when you're employed and set up in a shared network. But what's happened in Web2 is the network effects are monopolized, right? Correct. So you need permission to access Facebook. You need permission to use Apple, and they can deplatform you at any time, right? And so what's happened is that within these frameworks, they're actually anti-free markets, right? If you look at isolation, when you're actually buying, let's say, advertising in Apple or Facebook, you're not actually in a market where you're transacting between two parties who say, I'll sell you this, you buy this. You're transacting with an algorithm that decides on some level what you can buy to the benefit of the platform, not to the benefit of the parties. That doesn't sound like capitalism to me at all, right? And I think we forget that actually these platforms, because they've become monopolies in their own form, monopolies in their own environments, they're actually acting in, an anti-free market way, right? And so either you break them apart or which is hard too, or you create a new framework, and that's Web3. Because in Web3, everything's transparent. There can be no monopoly because no single party owns it. So let's say if Solana grew 1,000x or Sand grew 1,000x, as a hypothetical example. Well, then the point is that not only does that ecosystem benefit, but the whole space of Web3 grows as a result. And we see this. If Bitcoin goes up, everything in Web3 grows. It's not just the people who own Bitcoin. It's a whole ecosystem, right? So that's what's so cool and different about Web3.
Awesome. So you talked a lot about digital property rights, and you kind of alluded to it a little bit kind of in what you've just been talking about right now. I wanted to kind of go a little bit deeper on this and talk about, when we look at the parallel in the world right now, in the physical world, we see that with countries that have property rights, with countries that are able to enforce property rights, that we see a flourishing of economic activity and well-being and prosperity for all, right? Yes, and I think one of your narratives has also been that we can see that also in the digital world. Mm-hmm. But I wanted to ask a couple of questions on that. Number one is, generally when we talk about digital property rights, we talk about them in the context of Web3 based on cryptography and based on the fact of someone owning a particular key that proves ownership of a particular asset, NFT, whatever it may be. So going a little bit into the governance of this world, right? Mm-hmm. Is this a world where, like whoever has the key is the owner, and I want to kind of get into a little bit of digital squatters, right? Sure. And we can talk about hacks for exchanges or other things, or like, what are your views there? Because is this just the Wild West where, if you lose it and tough luck and you're up to your security and there's no justice there? Or is there a need for some type of a centralized, trusted intermediary that can reinstate access? And we'll come into real world assets as well, and I'll talk a little bit about there. But what are your thoughts? Is this the Wild West or is this something? Yeah.
No, so generally speaking, I'm not on the camp that sort of sits all the way into, let's call it a form of anarchism, as it were. Say, hey, you know what? Like, it's your assets. If you lose them, tough luck, right? Which, by the way, is some people's perspectives, right? Where they say, look, not your keys, not your assets, type of thing. And I would generally say there is an element of the fact that you have to have custody and safety of your keys and assets. We do need decentralization, but I do also believe that we're in an environment which does require delegated authority, right? So, when you talk about enforcement in the government, we don't say there's a difference between a government that essentially is controlled by, let's call it a dictator, that decides whether you can or cannot have it, whether as opposed to being in a democracy, where the you delegate someone to have that authority over you, and you can remove that power. Sure, it's not the same as having a direct vote, which is sometimes ungovernable, but you're electing someone into a position to ensure that your rights are governed in a certain manner that you find acceptable, right? So at the end of the day, in that framework, people still have a power, even if the power is only changed every 4 years or through electoral cycles or whatever. You still have the means of those change, which are respected, and I think that's an important part, right? So I think the same is true when you think about custody of assets and property rights, meaning that yes, we can own our own property, and with cryptography and Web3 and blockchain technology, we can secure the provenance and ownership of these assets, and therefore we can ensure that they are ours. But if we give them to a custodian because we think they're better at security, then there is an implicit agreement that they are handing it on our behalf, which is where regulation and governments come into play. Like, for instance, I don't believe, like some people might, that the sort of Web3 nation will stand alone without governments. I don't think so. And the reason why I don't think so is because while blockchain is a technological framework that embeds a lot of socio-political elements, we have to remember that they still serve a human purpose. Right? I think sometimes people get lost into the technology of it, including with AI, by the way, and then they sort of go into sort of the rabbit hole. But then we sometimes forget, well, but who does it serve, right? Correct. Technology doesn't serve itself. It serves a human purpose. And therefore, when it serves a human purpose, well, in this case, we're still needing to have a system of government, and we still need to eat and sleep and live somewhere, which means we have to pay our taxes, because something has to maintain the system.
Have some security.
That gives us safety and security.
Yeah,
exactly.
Safe, absolutely.
And just like we have had in history and in governments, where there is a pendulum, right, between our relationships between freedom and security, right? And we try to strike a balance between the two. How much full freedom do we want to have, as in how anarchic would we like to live, versus how much security are we willing to have on one hand, that basically says, I'm accepting a certain loss of freedom so that I can have that secure framework, so I have the freedom to do other things. Because at the same time, the safety and security provisions you put into place that seem restrictive will open up new forms of freedom. Like, for instance, the fact that I can safely transact with individuals and strangers comes from the fact that I'm delegating the security authority to someone else to ensure that I can safely transact with you without having the fear of you taking it away from me, for instance, right?
So without carrying an arm with you, just to make sure that you can enforce that security yourself.
Exactly, right? So I think in Web3 it's the same, right? So so what I'm not saying is that I think the difference about Web3 is that you now have a choice, which you didn't really have before, right? Properly, right? I have a choice in which I want to have self-custody, but I should also probably consider some in custody, and I should also be able to sort of have the security, and this is, I think, key now, security in which the governments, especially those that are regulated Web3 anyway, and have a say in this, to basically ensure that the government will protect my rights in the property of Web3. And the big thing is that I can now prove ownership. So the point is, when a theft took place, I can prove the history of that ownership, which, in Web2, we have to go to a court, right? And the court then adjudicates and says, did you really own this car? Okay, so show me all the proof and all that kind of stuff. And that proof is very manual, because it's kind of, not obvious, because it's not digital, and the provenance could be faked, or they're forgeries. How many forgeries have we seen in wills and testaments, for instance, where people are saying, you promised to give this to me. The person who actually made the promise is no longer here. So someone just produces a piece of paper that came out of nowhere. You go, oh, did this really happen? So all these things will be solved with blockchain, right? So again, we're not saying that blockchain will replace it, but it will enhance it, and it will create higher levels of trust. because now we can adjudicate trust between each other, because it won't be a debate. In society before, when we were hunter-gatherers, we only had about 100 to 150 people, right? Because generally Dunbar's number doesn't allow us to sort of extend beyond that. But we would all still have proper governance, because between a community of 100, there would be consensus who owns the asset. If that's your cow, and 30 or 40 other people in the community would vouch, that's your cow, right? You didn't need pen and paper or even a king to say that's your cow, because we all knew each other in the community. It's like in your family. If this is your pen, if it's your laptop, maybe when you're a child, your sister might come or some sibling might say, hey, that's my laptop. But you know what? We all know whose laptop this is, or we all know whose toy this is, right? So you can't argue. You won't do this because enough people know this. But when you reach 1,000 people or 100,000 people, I don't know, right? It's a stranger. It's your word against mine.
Correct.
And that's why we need a central authority. And now what blockchain does, it takes that framework where we can go literally back to a hunter-gatherer-like environment, where except the authority and the policing and the validity isn't a small group of people that have to adjudicate and provide proof and provide evidence. But the blockchain is the evidence. So that means we can scale trust in all areas, by the way, not just in this example, at an infinite scale, right? To me, this is the real powerful thing. So I think it enhances governance. It enhances government. It creates better frameworks of trust and security because we can now audit it all the way from the beginning.
But yeah, you're talking about the digital space, though, because obviously once you bridge over into the real world, right, then there obviously blockchains can't tell you what time it is or what the temperature outside. It's just time is a different thing, but what's the temperature, or has it rained outside in the real world, or was a particular condition in the real world trigger for a smart contract to pay out something or other. So in that case,
but I would say even though it can't tell specifically some things, the conditions in which they were released are always known. So there's no arbitrary aspect as to what the conditions are. For instance, if you say, on this day, right, or on this sort of minute, we release certain assets or we give it to someone else.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right, exactly. So these conditions are known. So I think there are more levels of truth that you can attach yourself to than if it was just one word versus another.
Yeah. I still think it's difficult when you come into the real world because, again, what date something is being issued, these are all digital assets. But if you start talking about, property on a blockchain, as an example, right? If something is burned down on that property, the blockchain doesn't know that. So
yes. So my point our emphasis has been mostly focused on really digital properties and digital assets, which actually we think is frankly the more valuable perspective, because digital property anyway is a representation of not just digital ownership, but network effects implied within them, which is what we think sort of how you measure value on these assets. In Web 2 or in the traditional world, shall we say, real estate, let's say you own a house, right? You can put it on chain. Right? It's a mechanism that people talk about with RWAs, for instance. But you need an oracle, right? And the oracle then has to prove that proof in the middle. And again, I think this is a future that's definitely important, but it is one that needs essentially the intervention of, basically governments, because that's something that absolutely needs some level of third-party trust that is enforceable. So, I think a lot of the regulation will follow that aspect of when you put something on chain, whether and you securitize it. Well, then there are frameworks around that you need to sort of produce that provide appropriate security, protection, and awareness, and obviously transparency around that, because you have an off-chain oracle. But anything that's on-chain, that's natively on-chain,
absolutely,
tokens, or there's no question.
Exactly, complete provenance. So let's talk about kind of your projections and views of the future. So right now, obviously, Animoca brands yourself. The discourse is about those digital property rights, not so much the real world. That world right now in the crypto asset world is called at $2.6 trillion US, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Let's go forward 1 year, 5 years, 10 years. What do you see as the value of this ecosystem in the future? And what timeline are you going to give to that value?
So first of all, I think that in the near term, let's call it 12, 18 months, I think we can conceive of a doubling or tripling of the space. And then basically over a 5 or 10 year period, I mean, I'm expecting the space to accelerate, 100 to 200 times or even bigger. Right? And let me explain
100
exactly.
to 200 trillion dollars?
Yes, I think
What type of time frame? Sorry?
Oh, I mean, within a decade, I think we could reach that kind of number over time. Now, the reason why I say this, and it does seem like a rather sort of ginormous number in relative sense, is that I view this as the enablement of, and it's prefaced on the basis that we will have, billions of property owners. Right? And I think in a Web3 narrative, it is entirely conceivable that we can have billion property owners because we can have billion token holders. This is not possible in the physical world, even though we have property rights. The idea that we could have a billion property owners is hard, but we also know that in those countries where you have the majority of people who own some form of property that has a sort of accruable value and network effects implied with them, that the economies and GDPs are significantly larger. So the per capita output of that country is bigger. Right? So you take one extreme, North Korea, bigger population than, say, Switzerland or even Hong Kong, right? But the GDPs of those couldn't be more different. Right? And of course, the person would much rather live in Hong Kong or in Switzerland than go to North Korea, despite the fact that it maybe has more people and has more utility, and so the fact that there's absolutely zero ability for capital formation because nobody probably is, right? And so I view the digital world today as a very North Korean narrative. Nobody has property rights. We don't own anything in this place. The accrued value only goes to the kings and queens essentially of Web2. Whereas, well, now imagine what happens in the physical world if property rights, which we already know is a value generator, isn't 1%, but maybe 20% or 30% of the world could sort of ascend into this let's call it physical property rights world. Well, what would happen to the value of our physical assets? They would accelerate too, right? And so my point on this one is that when I say this space could grow, it's because of the fact that it is the one framework where I believe access to property ownership, right, is possible at scale. I mean, if, and again, this might be a very select example, but if you happen to own an Ethereum or Bitcoin token of 5 years ago, right, just one or two or whatever number you put in, you would have created, incredible sort of wealth generation just from that in relative terms to the money that you put in, or the amount of effort that you had contributed relatively, right? And in the early days of economic development in the kind of countries, be it the UK, France, or America, where property rights started to become a real thing, that value formation accelerated as well, right? And so we see the same kind of frameworks developing. Also, we think the world will be much more digital, right? I mean, it's already very digital, but it makes more sense for it to be even more digital. And I don't mean that people won't go out in nature and hike and so on. Of course, that will happen. But the fact that we're spending so much more time digitally and that the value of what we do will all come from more digital constructs means that we're already shifted to the world where the value is virtual, right? And as I said earlier, the biggest companies in the world are what? Absolutely. They're companies who are selling us virtual stuff. They're not companies who are and the attention of the virtual stuff. They're not selling us physical things, right?
Stuff.
Yeah, no. exactly.
Yet I know you have to go in a couple of minutes, but I want to ask you 2-3 more questions.
Sure.
Kind of short answers, which is, in the next 5 years, is there a particular part of Web3 or crypto or the blockchain space that you do not think will be around?
Oh, not be around.
That will not be
interesting. So I personally think 5 years is too early to think that there will be any stage in which we talk about true consolidation. So the reason why is that I think the adoption in Web 2 and Web 3, or listen, Web 1 and Web 3 are very similar. So right now I view Web 3 adoption similar to internet sort of post.com bubble 2001-ish type of thing.
Yep.
And you can sort of measure it based on the number of DeFi wallets relative to the number of internet connections, right? But the barriers to entry weren't the same. The barriers to entry in the early days of the internet was really a physical one, and this comfort of having a dial-up modem and then a broadband modem and then signing all that up in TCP/IP, and there was some technical restriction that sort of onboarded you, but it was the same thing, which was awareness, knowledge, as in because it wasn't difficult really to have a modem and set it up. It was just sort of discomfort with something new that you didn't understand. And in Web3, it's essentially having a crypto wallet. You need that to participate. And again, it's not hard. Actually, it's not that difficult. If people say, "Oh my goodness, I have to remember seed phrase." Okay, I mean, yeah, it's weird maybe today, but it's not that hard. Like, it's 12, 24, 36, 48 words, doesn't really matter. And again, I'm not saying that that's the best way of doing it. Custodial approaches as well. My point is just that it is not that hard. If you want to open a Web3 wallet, you can do this in minutes, right? But again, it's unfamiliarity. You don't have financial literacy. You don't know why you're doing it. What's an NFT? Like, again, we're at that stage. And I think the adoption that we're seeing is very similar in that way. So when you think about when consolidation took place, it didn't happen up until maybe 5 to 10 years later, when that industry sort of matured. Companies will come and go, but a full-on consolidation, I think, won't happen. What I think will happen when you think about what will go away is that my hope is that we won't be talking about Web3 as a term. Right?
Yeah.
So the idea to me would be more like we're just in this new internet of ownership, and we all hold a stake in stuff, and we will no longer have to coin it as Web3.
Sure.
In the same way that we don't have to talk about digital music as MP3s. We're just listening to music, right? And we really care about it. Right? So I think that type of stuff should go away, and I think we'll have success when we no longer talk about it in those terms, and when we just simply go into sort of using this new internet of ownership and benefiting from its framework without having to really fully understand the frameworks. And that, to that extent, that also means that while I think there'll be many reasons for us to have L1, L2s, and I believe there will be many of them. I don't think that it's just going to be one or two. It doesn't make sense.
Absolutely.
Again, those will be abstracted for most users. So in the same way that we don't have to understand the underpinnings of TCP/IP, for instance, except that there's different networks, because it's shared, we'll have bridges and systems that abstract it for us, so it's easier for us to maintain and get the benefit of them. But we don't actually have to sort of be forced to use one network or the other.
And where do you see the adoption happening mostly? Is there a particular geography that you see this taking off in a much bigger way than others?
Asia, no question. For now, for the time being, Asia is the fastest growth market. Again, I think once the US starts to create some clarity around their direction, which politically right now, politically right now, there seems to be a little bit of a battle going on, and I won't comment on that in itself.
Yes.
I think the US, we can't write them off in the sense that once they come in full force, I think they possibly can become the leading force in Web3 again. But right now, the leading force in Web3 is clearly Asia. When you think about the adoption in places like Southeast Asia, when you think about the government policies in Hong Kong and Japan, and again in Southeast Asia, they're way more forward. They're way more friendlier, both for political and for consumer reasons. Hong Kong has actually launched an Ethereum ETF, for instance, and outside of the Bitcoin spot ETF, as an example, right? And even China, even though, you can't trade the tokens, has been advocating blockchain in Web3, broadly speaking, as well. So you see an interesting bifurcation of the world as well, where, normally the West, specifically the US, tends to lead in all areas of technology, right? But in Web3, it has fallen behind for obvious reasons, partially also because there's been unclarity on the regulatory side. So for that reason, I think Asia is leading and will continue to lead. But again, this could very easily change in a year or two.
Wonderful. Yet, I want to be respectful of your time. I want to thank you also for all the work that you're doing in this space and trying to promote the ecosystem, like many of us. So it's a wonderful pleasure to have you on the show, and I hope to bring you back on in the future to deep dive a little bit more in detail. We could have hours of conversation about this. But take care, have a lovely day, and thanks for being on the show.